The LA Chargers are one of the most disappointing teams in the entire 2023-24 season, and after an absolute blowout against the Las Vegas Raiders where they lost with a score of 63-21, they decided to fire Brandon Staley. And while that was 100% the correct move to make, now the LA Chargers have to find a replacement for Brandon Staley. So in today's video, I want to talk about 4 different coaches who I think could definitely replace Brandon Staley and get this team back to where they should be. So with that all said, let's get into the video. So to lay out all the different possibilities of who the LA Chargers could have as their future head coach, I wanted to give you guys 2 offensive-minded coaches and 2 defensive-minded coaches. And yes, I understand 100% why everyone wants the LA Chargers to hire an offensive coach, but I do think a defensive coach is definitely within the realm of possibility. At the end of the day, the offense was pretty decent this year. They weren't special, but they were very average, whereas the defense was bottom 5 in a lot of different statistics. So again, 1000% I do think they should hire an offensive-minded coach, but I could definitely understand seeing them go out there and look for a defensive-minded coach. We'll talk more about it as we get through the video, but let's go ahead and start off with my number 1 coaching candidate, Ben Johnson. You're going to hear me talk a ton about Ben Johnson for the rest of the offseason, as he is probably the number 1 contender for about every team's coaching job. And for me, it makes a ton of sense. At the end of the day, he is currently the offensive coordinator for the Detroit Lions, but he has been in a lot of different positions and has done a lot of very good things. Ben Johnson has been a coach back all the way in 2009, where he was a graduate assistant for Boston College. And then he would move on to the NFL in 2012, where he was an offensive assistant with the Miami Dolphins. He would move around to a couple different coaching positions with the Miami Dolphins until eventually he was the offensive quality control coach all the way back with the Detroit Lions in 2019. And after working his way up, he is currently the offensive coordinator. And at the end of the day, I think the Ben Johnson system that he is currently running would work perfectly with Justin Herbert. And the reason why I say that is because this is a team that should honestly be running the ball more, but they don't have the running backs to actually do that. Austin Eckler, as much as I love him, is more of a pass-catching back who needs the ball in his hands to create plays. He isn't necessarily a run-it-down-the-throat guy like a Ben Johnson might use him as. Isaiah Spiller is a nice young player, but I don't think he really fits into the same system as Ben Johnson, and neither does Joshua Kelly. I do think if Ben Johnson does come to this team, he's definitely going to work on 3 things: the offensive line, the running back room, and the defensive line. Ben Johnson loves to run the ball, he loves to play action, he likes creating easy looks for guys like Justin Herbert. And you've seen this Ben Johnson system work great wonders with Jared Goff and the Detroit Lions offense. At the end of the day, Jared Goff is not a top 10 quarterback, but Ben Johnson is making him look like one of those guys. So just imagine what he could do with a stud like Justin Herbert. And the nice thing about this position is I think it's a relatively desirable spot. You have some good pieces defensively, even though they don't perform up to standard. You have guys like Sebastian Joseph Day, Joey Bosa, when healthy, Eric Kendricks, Khalil Mack, Derwin James, Asante Samuel Jr. There are some names on this defensive side of things. So unlike a defense like the Detroit Lions where they don't have a ton of studs, this defense actually does. And when you look at the offense, which is what Ben Johnson is going to be primarily working on, they already have some pretty solid pieces. There's already Keenan Allen. Quentin Johnson is a young, developing rookie. You also have guys like Mike Williams who are going to come back from their injuries. And then along the offensive line, you have certain players like Rashawn Slater and Zion Johnson who have shown decent signs of development. And I do think with the offensive linemen, as they grow into the system with Ben Johnson, it's only going to improve their play. This to me is the number 1 hire that they should definitely be going for. Of all the offensive coaches, I think he is a mile ahead of basically all of them. So that's my first pick for the offensive-minded coach. The next coach I'm going to talk about is going to be a defensive-minded coach, and it is going to be Mike McDonald, the defensive coordinator for the Baltimore Ravens. Similar to Ben Johnson, he has been coaching in the high school and NFL level since basically 2008. He was a linebackers coach in high school all the way back in 2008, where he would go on to be a graduate assistant for Georgia, spends a couple years at Georgia, would then go to the Baltimore Ravens in 2014. Mike would work with the Baltimore Ravens between 2014 to 2020, where he would work different defensive coaching positions. He would then get his biggest break of all time, becoming the Michigan defensive coordinator all the way back in 2021. He would have a very successful season with the Michigan Wolverines before ultimately becoming the defensive coordinator for the Baltimore Ravens for the 2022 season. And thus far this year, there is a very strong argument to say the Baltimore Ravens have the best defense in the entire NFL. Defensively, they rank number 2 in points per game allowed, yards per game allowed. They also rank number 1 in points per play, yards per play, and touchdowns allowed per game. And this is not an extremely impressive depth chart when you look at the Baltimore Ravens. Do they have some studs? 1000%. Guys like Patrick Queen, Roquan Smith, Marlon Humphrey, Kyle Hamilton have all turned into very good players. When you look up and down the defense, it's not like they have a bunch of studs here and there. And when you look at the LA Chargers, defensively speaking, they have some studs of themselves. Derwin James is probably the best safety in the NFL. Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack, when healthy, have some potential to be a very good defensive line unit. And while I don't love their linebacking core, they have some names there as well. I think if you allow Mike McDonald to really take control of his defense and draft whoever he wants, I definitely do think that he could have a very good turnaround season with this defense. And if you give this LA Chargers team a top 10 defense, they are going to be a damn good team. Because whoever you have as your offensive coordinator, you're going to have a good offense. Justin Herbert, Keenan Allen, that offensive line, that running game, Austin Eckler, there's enough pieces there to at least carry that team to having a decent offense. Hell, we've seen him carry Kellen Moore to look like like a pretty good offensive coordinator. If you give this team a very good defense led by a very good defensive-minded coach, I could definitely see a turnaround that this team desperately needs. If you're looking for a home run hit on the defensive side of things, I think Mike McDonald might be the guy. I know some people might be skeptical of the idea of not hiring an offensive-minded coach to help a guy like Justin Herbert really develop into that next stage of his career, but what I will say to that is I don't really think the offense is the reason why they're losing games. It's the defense. This defense doesn't get stops, they don't create turnovers, they give up a ton of yards and a ton of points, they don't win teams games. But if you can get a defensive-minded coach who can come in there and completely change the identity and trajectory of that defense, the sky's the limit for this team. So again, Ben Johnson is my number one guy, but I think if they don't get Ben Johnson, Mike McDonald could make a ton of sense. But let us go ahead and move on to our next offensive-minded coach, which is going to be Eric Bieniemy, the current assistant head coach and offensive coordinator for the Washington Commanders. Now, interesting little tidbit about Eric Bieniemy, he was actually drafted by the San Diego Chargers all the way back in 1991 with their second-round pick. So in a sense, this would be kind of a little bit of a homecoming for him. Now, in his coaching career, he has been working since basically 2002. He would initially get his first real big break as the University of Colorado hired him as their running backs coach. He would then work for UCLA, then come to the NFL with the Minnesota Vikings, then go back to Colorado before ultimately finding a new job with the Kansas City Chiefs. In 2013, he did become the Chiefs running back coach before ultimately taking over the offensive coordinator position between the years of 2018 and 2022. And we all kind of know the rest of the story. He would develop a guy in Patrick Mahomes who turned out to be a pretty good player. He would take some players like Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, some decent offensive linemen, and make them an absolute juggernaut. And after a lot of people thought he would go out there and take a head coaching position, he actually would stay as an offensive coordinator to work with the Washington Commanders. I don't actually know 100% why he did take the Commanders position, but I do think it was more of his way to spread his wings and get a little bit under the Andy Reid shadow. And with the Washington Commanders, while the Commanders haven't had a ton of success, he's turned Sam Howell into a very respectable quarterback. And I think that should go a long way. This is not an offense that is led by a guy like Patrick Mahomes. Sam Howell is essentially a rookie quarterback who leads the league in passing yards. And I'm sorry, if you give Eric Bieniemy a guy like Justin Herbert, you've seen what he's done with Patrick Mahomes. Imagine what he can do with Herbert. This is an offense that is talented just like the Kansas City Chiefs. In fact, nowadays, it might be a little bit more talented than the Chiefs are. And in 2022, when the Kansas City Chiefs made their Super Bowl run, they didn't really have a ton of receiving weapons. So imagine what he can do with Justin Herbert, Keenan Allen, Mike Williams, and Quinn Johnston. Now, I guarantee you, Eric Bieniemy would be extremely interested in this position. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, he does have a little bit of history with the LA Chargers. Well, at that point, the San Diego Chargers, but you get my point. Eric Bieniemy has been a resident of California multiple times throughout his career. And for Eric Bieniemy, working with a guy like Justin Herbert might be super appealing, so I definitely do think this is a real possibility for the LA Chargers. But lastly, I'm going to talk about another defensive coach, and I'm going to give you guys a couple honorable mentions at the very end of the video. My second defensive-minded head coach possibility is actually the only coach on this list who has any sort of head coaching experience, and that is going to be Dan Quinn, the defensive coordinator for the Dallas Cowboys. Dan Quinn has been coaching since 1994 and got his big break in the NFL back in 2001 with the San Francisco 49ers. He would obviously become known for his Legion of Boom defense with the Seattle Seahawks for many years. And of course, in 2015, he'd become the head coach for the Atlanta Falcons. He would coach there for 5 years, get them to a Super Bowl, and blow a big lead. And then in 2020, after getting fired by the Atlanta Falcons, he would join the Dallas Cowboys to become their defensive coordinator. And since 2021, the Dallas Cowboys have had arguably a top 5 defense every single year. And what many people don't realize about this Dallas Cowboys defense is back in 2020, they were arguably the worst defense of all time. And I think that says a lot about Dan Quinn. His ability to turn around an absolutely abysmal defense from 1 year ago to being one of the best in the next year. Obviously, Micah Parsons and having some talented players on the defensive side of things definitely did help him, but imagine if he can do that same thing with a team like the LA Chargers. Imagine him going into this year's draft and going out there and getting a guy like a Dallas Turner who could potentially be a Micah Parsons for the LA Chargers. Then all of a sudden, you have the Dallas Cowboys 2.0 for LA. Again, this is a Chargers team that already has a pretty solid offense and already has some pieces offensively that a guy like Dan Quinn might not really have to mess around with it that much. And he might be able to actually keep a guy like Kellen Moore around because he already has experience with him in Dallas. LA Chargers fans aren't probably going to want to hear that, but I do think having some consistency with a coach in some sort of way for this offense could benefit them. But I also wouldn't be shocked if he decided to bring in his own guy to be the offensive coordinator. Nonetheless, for whoever they do decide to put in the offensive coordinator position, I do think the offense will still be rolling. Dan Quinn has proven to be able to turn around any defense. He turned around the Seattle Seahawks defense in 1 year. He turned around the Dallas Cowboys defense in 1 year. I guarantee you he could turn around this LA Chargers defense in 1 year. He would all of a sudden have a top 10 defensive unit to go along with arguably a top 10 offensive unit. And as long as they draft well with the draft capital they do have, and as long as they spend their money wisely, given the fact they are a couple negative dollars in the cap space department, I think this team could definitely have a big turnaround season with Dan Quinn as the head coach. There's a couple of concerns with Dan Quinn. Number one, a lot of people probably don't want Dan Quinn because he is a defensive-minded coach. Number two, I don't really know if he really wants to leave Dallas. He's had multiple opportunities to go to different teams in the past couple seasons, but has ultimately stayed with the Dallas Cowboys to be their defensive coordinator. So I just don't know if that's going to be a real possibility. And the obvious third reason why we should be concerned about him is he was the Atlanta Falcons coach for a few years, and obviously they never really were that great outside of the one season in 2016. And while that definitely is a concern for me, I do think though the fact he does have some head coaching experience does tell you that he knows how to develop a roster, and hopefully he did learn from that experience as the Atlanta Falcons head coach so that one day he could become a head coach and be a very good one for many years. Now, a couple other honorable mentions that I do want to mention because some people might say them in the comment section below: Bill Belichick, Jim Harbaugh, Press Taylor, and Bobby Slowick. Bill Belichick to me doesn't make a lot of sense because why would he take a different position that is not the New England Patriots job? He is obviously a lot older of a coach, and while I do think he could come in there and definitely fine-tune this team, I don't think that Bill Belichick is the same coach he was just a few years ago with Tom Brady. Do I think this team could be better with Bill Belichick? 1000%. Do I still think Bill Belichick is the greatest coach of all time? 100%. But what I will say is I just don't think he's the right coach for this job. Next up is Jim Harbaugh. As much as I like Jim Harbaugh as a coach, and he obviously had a little bit of success with the 49ers for several years, I just don't know if you want to bring in kind of a controversial figure like him. He's obviously been suspended with Michigan, and honestly, I just don't know if he's going to be that interested in returning into the NFL given the success the Wolverines have had. Next is Press Taylor, the current offensive coordinator for the Jacksonville Jaguars. I think he's a little bit too young to eventually take that next step. Currently, he is learning a ton from Doug Peterson, but I just don't think he's going to be a head coach this year. But maybe in 2 to 3 years, I could definitely see that becoming a real possibility. And lastly is Bobby Slowick, the current offensive coordinator for the Houston Texans. While I do think this would be a good hire, I just don't know if Bobby Slowick has proven to be a head coach material quite yet. He's worked with the San Francisco 49ers, obviously as their passing game coordinator, and obviously he has had a ton of success with guys like CJ Stroud. Could he be a great offensive mind for a guy like Justin Herbert? 1000%, but I just don't think he's quite yet there. Similar to Press Taylor, give it 1, maybe 2 more years and I could definitely see him taking a head coaching job. But that is everything I have for you guys in this video. If you did enjoy the video, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button because that would help me out a ton. And if you want to add or disagree with anything that I have said in this video, make sure to let me know in the comment section below and I'll make sure to send a reply back to you. But I love you guys. Peace.